All right, let's jump right in. Today we're digging into a really powerful thought experiment from our source material. It takes a fantasy scenario, one that's being pushed by some on the far right, and gives it a serious, hard look in the light of the day. So let's get right to it. The whole thing kicks off with this very provocative question. Just picture it for a second. What if, overnight, every single person of Indian origin just left? Every doctor, every IT professional, every student. What would Ireland actually look and feel like the very next morning?
And our source material really asks you to visualize this scene, because for some, this isn't a bad dream. It's actually presented as the solution to Ireland's problems. But we're about to explore what the data says would really happen.
Okay, so what exactly is this fantasy promising? What are the specific claims being made? Let's break it down. So there it is, laid out plain and simple. The logic is pretty straightforward, right? Remove a group of people, and suddenly there's more for everyone else. It's an appealing idea on the surface, but our source material is about to take this apart, piece by piece, starting with one of the most vital sectors in the country.
Right. First up, healthcare. The claim is that with fewer people, the system would magically run better. But when you actually look at the data, well, it shows the exact opposite would be true.
And yeah, the source is crystal clear on this. This isn't about freeing up a few beds or shortening waiting lists. It would trigger a system-wide slowdown, a collapse, really. So, why? Why would that happen?
Well, here's your answer, 54%. Let that number sink in for a second. In 2024, more than half of all practicing nurses in Ireland were trained outside the country. We're not talking about filling a few gaps here. This is literally the backbone of the nursing workforce.
And it's pretty much the same story with doctors. Over 43% are foreign trained. The reality is, the Irish healthcare system as it exists today simply could not function without this international talent.
And of all those internationally trained nurses, the single biggest pipeline, the one that keeps hospital wards running, comes directly from India. Their departure wouldn't just be felt, it would be absolutely catastrophic.
But this impact goes way beyond the hospital walls. Let's talk about the engine room of the modern Irish economy. Technology, finance, and all those highly skilled jobs that make it all tick.
The source makes it really clear that these aren't jobs that could just be filled by someone else the next day. A huge number of Indian professionals come here under the critical skills permit, and that permit exists for one reason. Ireland doesn't have enough local workers with these very specific in-demand skills. And the numbers on this are just stark. In 2024, India was the #1 source for employment permits. We're talking more than half of all new critical skills permits issued. If you remove that, you create a massive, immediate vacuum in Ireland's most competitive industries.
And look, this isn't some big secret. The government's own reports consistently flag these shortages in the tech sector. So this isn't a story about immigrants taking jobs. It's a story about them filling a critical skills gap that allows Irish companies to compete on a global scale.
And this matters for everyone's wallet. Data from the Central Statistics Office shows Indian nationals are, on average, the highest weekly earners among all foreign workers. This means they contribute a huge amount in taxes and have significant spending power in the economy.
In fact, they accounted for 3.4% of the country's total weekly earnings in 2024. So if this community were to leave, the tax base that pays for our schools, our roads, and yes, our hospitals would take an immediate and serious hit.
But the fantasy isn't just about jobs and healthcare. It also promises easy fixes for really complex problems like the housing crisis and crime. So let's see if the data backs any of that up.
When you look at housing, the contrast between the myth and the reality is just staggering. The idea that a group making up less than 2% of the population is the cause of a nationwide crisis, it just doesn't add up. The source points to a much more familiar problem, doesn't it? Decades of policy failures and simply not building enough homes.
The whole narrative about crime also gets debunked by official data. Garda figures show zero evidence linking this community to a rise in crime. In fact, the data tells a much darker story, a rise in hate crimes targeting them. They are far more likely to be the victims than the perpetrators.
So let's put some hard numbers on this. How many people are we actually talking about? Well, the latest data shows it's roughly 78,000 people of Indian origin living in Ireland.
That's less than 2% of the total population. So this entire debate is revolving around fewer than 2 people in every 100, a tiny fraction of the population, whose contribution, as we've seen, is just massively outsized.
So let's go back to where we started, to that thought experiment.
But this time, let's look at it armed with the actual facts from our source material. What is the real consequence of this fantasy?
Our source material really captures the consequences in this one powerful sentence. If every Indian left tomorrow, Ireland would not feel lighter, freer, or safer. It would feel emptier, poorer, and weaker. The fantasy of liberation is met with the cold, hard reality of decline.
And this really gets us to the ultimate conclusion here. Scapegoating a minority group is just a distraction. It stops us from tackling the deep structural problems, the underinvestment, the broken planning system, that are the real cause of so many people's anxieties.
And so we end with this question. The source material basically forces us to stop looking for easy targets and to instead look in the mirror. Because the solutions to Ireland's problems don't lie in subtracting people, but in confronting some very difficult truths and making the hard choices needed to build a country that actually works for everyone who lives here.